for what?
Wait until we're live.
Oh, I see.
Hello and welcome everyone to the 2025 lecture series at SHI. Klinga kleinach dus kla yuchat duatsauk, like ka kleinach J Zeller yuchat duatsauk, ach nachatsati ka guantan ayachat, deshitan yadi ayachat. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for joining us today as part of Sealaska Heritage Institute's lecture series. Sealaska Heritage Institute is a Native nonprofit dedicated to perpetuating and enhancing Tlingit, ʼeidé, and Tsimshian cultures of Southeast Alaska. As a nonprofit organization, Sealaska Heritage couldn't do our work throughout Southeast Alaska without donations. If you would like to donate to Sealaska Heritage, please visit sealaskaheritage.org/giving. At heart, ʼeidé will always be the 9-year-old eagle killer whale from a big family roaming the streets of Juneau in the early 1960s. His family moved to Anchorage in the 60s, and he eventually worked on fishing boats, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and went off to photography school to become a photographer. ʼeidé Larry has been a photographer for decades and also earned the rank of full professor working with young people. His work is in many of the well-known national and international museums, which makes the Juneau kid in him gratified. Larry will discuss his art, the creative process, visual narratives, Northwest Coast professional practices, including motivations, inspirations, tactics, and goals that were successful. He will share the stories of his journeys and emphasize the significant steps taken to succeed. It will become clear that it takes a community to become a professional, and many people and organizations helped along the way. Please silence your cell phones at this time, and as a reminder, there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So thank you for showing up. I do appreciate it. Like talking to people, and students and everybody else. So when I used to live here as a little kid, I remember walking around here. It looked way different back then, of course. You know, and I had my own way of introducing myself to people, which my mom taught me. You know, she taught me how to introduce myself when I was about 5, and I was just a little guy, and people would ask me, "What's your name?" I'd say, "My name," and I'd stand up straighter, and I'd say very loud and clear, "My name is Larry McNeil, ʼeidé, T. Harbor Jackson McNeil." You know, and, so that was my standard introduction to everybody. You know, and part of the name is. T. Harbor Jackson is kind of a nickname for ʼeidé, and he used to live in the late 1800s. He had a place on the beach here, which was right across, you know, where the tank farm used to be. So his place used to be right there, and he had wives. You know, it was a tradition back then, you know, to have wives. And when the Europeans arrived, of course, you know, they didn't approve of that part of our culture, you know, and so him and his wives got kind of hounded out to T. Harbor. So he got the nickname, you know, T. Harbor Jackson. You know, that's what he was known by. So around here, when I greet family and friends, it's, "Hey, T. Harbor, how you doing, man?" You know, and so you know. When people say that, I feel right at home. But anyway, his formal name was ʼeidé. And I'm from the Gushi-Hit, from Klekwan, so our people are from Klekwan up at the Chilkat Valley. I've been an artist for decades, and right now I'm Professor Emeritus, and I earned my Master of Fine Arts many, many decades ago. And before that, I was a commercial fisherman when I was a young man. And I like to say this too, all around good guy to have in a storm. You know, and I loves coffee. ancestors. This is my mother and grandmother down at 906 West 7th. So I don't know how many of you remember 7th Street, back in the early 1960s, but that's where a lot of the native families lived, Tlingits, Haidas, Tsimshians. It was kind of our own little community there. And my grandmother's name is Kasanuk, and mother's Kajasadi. So it's Mary Brown Betts and Anita C. McNeil. Oh yeah, that's my other name, Charles. So I was named after my mom. Her name was Charlotte. So I like to say I was named after my mom too. So that was her own little kind of secret. Now everybody knows. Many of the crucial strategies were and are generally made by the matrilineal leaders, as a lot of you already know. And this photograph is likely made by our uncle, Judson Brown, probably in the 1940s in 906 West 7th Street. And this was the hub for our family, our grandmother's house. It was a killer whale fin house. Not the formal one from Klekwan, but informally. And this is West 7th Street in Juneau, the neighborhood. And this photograph is courtesy of Patricia Adkison. So I don't see Patricia in. Oh, Patty. what impeccable timing. I love that. So Gunoshish, Patty. This is her photograph. And she allowed me to borrow it for this presentation. And it's the only photograph I've ever seen that shows the neighborhood this well. And what I did was I put numbers by each one of them, and there's houses. And of course, in the 1930s and 40s, these houses were all on stilts. So these houses had to be filled in by the tailings from the gold mine. And another ancestor now, Shuguni Judson Brown. He's chief of the Killer Whale Fin House up in Klekwan, and he's a maternal uncle, founding board member of the Sealaska Heritage Institute, right where we are right now, land claims member of the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood, and he became an officer of the Alaska Native Brotherhood when they were starting the land claims back in the late 1920s. And I think he was just in his mid-20s then. So a lot of those leaders like him, they started out their careers in the struggle when they were very, very young. I trained as a commercial fisherman at age 16 out of Kodiak by somebody I could most closely call a drill sergeant. So I don't know if any of you ever trained to be a commercial fisherman, but that's how you're trained. The captain doesn't train you, the deck boss does. And we learned 3 essential lifelong skills as a commercial fisherman. Always be early, never late. And I've carried that on throughout my entire life. Didn't stop as a fisherman. Always be perfectionist when it counts. And never stop learning. You're a lifelong learner. That comes from being a fisherman, not being a scholar. But it carries on as being a scholar too, though. In addition to highly skilled tasks and a strong work ethic, there is a magic ingredient that our mom liked to call uncanny luck. My favorite workstation was the roller man who hauled in the halibut and set the pace for the boat. We'd often work in 24-hour stretches and even 48 hours straight when the fish were hitting. Our dad liked to say, winter is for sleeping, now we work. So these are the halibut that we're catching. This was out of Seward. And they were big. These were 200-pound halibut. I made this photograph in the summer of 1973 when we completely refurbished the Yukon, which was the family boat. I was also in a transitionary phase between being a commercial fisherman and shifting into photography. So for me, this is a very significant historical photograph because it marked a divergence in where I was going with who I was. I like this photograph. After I became a photographer, our mom once mentioned she was a little surprised because she thought I'd be a writer. I'd have journals all over the house and lost nearly all of them, but was gratified to learn that our mom saved one of them from decades ago. So this is another one of those perfect photographs for me, because it's such a strong visual of what was happening with writing. I was doing lots of writing. And here's a couple of recent examples of essays that I've written for various catalogs. Contributing essays to the Alaska Native Reader, and was published by Duke University Press. And a recent one is by the Whitney Museum for Jean Quick-to-See Smith in her catalog titled Memory Map. That was a really nice thing that happened too, because Jean Quick-to-See Smith she has national stature as an Indigenous artist. And she knew me pretty well. And she got together with the Whitney when they were planning out the catalog, and she insisted that I write one of the chapters. And I thought that was really nice. So there she was. She was right in the thick of it, advocating for me to write a chapter for her. So that was very gratifying too. I learned I had a talent for photography when I was about 17. And this is one of my first cameras. When I learned photography in a formal setting in photography school, it was the era of Nikon F2s. So a lot of my classmates had Nikon F2 cameras, these really beautiful professional cameras. But I wanted to learn with a camera from the year I was born. So this is going to give me away. I was born in 1955, and I wanted to learn photography in a very formal setting with a camera that was made in the same year I was born. So I did the research, and I learned that Leica made what's called a 3F camera. It was made when I was, same year I was born. So I wanted to have this kinship, to my tools. And there it is, the Leica 3F that I learned with. Even with scholarships and school loans, there was no way I could ever afford to go to the photography school that I wished to attend. And it was dumb luck that the Trans-Alaska Pipeline happened at the same time I was accepted to the school. This is Pipeline Local Union 798 from Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it was such a surreal experience for anybody who lived through that era, the pipeline era. It was like a gold rush state at that time. It was just like the Wild West. And there it was, right in the thick of it. And an odd thing happened with this because the traditional pipeliners, they love welding pipe, and for them to have an oil pipeline above ground was unholy. It was like the devil came down, and none of them wanted anything to do with it. But I was just an apprentice, and so eventually I learned how to do all the tasks they're called vertical supports. And what it is, you see those fins on the top there? They're filled with ammonia. And what it does, it keeps the permafrost from thawing the ground so the pipeline won't shift around and so forth. So because the 798ers didn't like it, so after about a month, I was a crew chief. And so the head of Morrison Knutson, who ran that camp, drove by in his fancy pickup truck, and he saw me walking the pipeline. And I was doing all the work by myself. And he calmed me down, and I thought I was going to be fired, because I was violating safety rules. And he asked for my badge. He took my badge, and I was sure I was fired. And he came back later that afternoon. He said, Larry McNeil, this crew is yours now. So, so I got that crew. I was 20 years old at the time. I had my own crew, and I was getting journeyman's pay. So it was a deal that he made with the union. So I owe gratitude to both the union, the Tulsa, Oklahoma group. Yes, thank you. And the superintendent from Morrison Knutson. So for me, that was a great learning experience, because there I was. I made myself highly visible, as always working, even when there is nobody else there. And because of that, I was able to pay for my entire education. That was just phenomenal. So I owe that to being a commercial fisherman, that work ethic. That's what I brought. Excuse me. I found that with photography, I was still drawn to telling visual narratives. And this one photograph helped set the stage for future work. It set me free to pursue my own style. It was made while nearly finished with photography school. And it's titled Real Indians. And I really love it, just because it has, this kind of absurdity to it in a quirky kind of way. And it's been collected by a lot of museums over the decades. For example, when I went to Santa Fe last year, it was, again, just by dumb luck, it was showing at the New Mexico Museum of Art in Santa Fe. So that was nice too. For me, it was kind of like going back in time, and seeing this print that I made that kind of set the stage for my work. And there it was showing right then and there. Visual narratives, that's the bottom line there. This photograph is titled Once a Time in America, and it's from 2003. Back to 907 West 7th Street with mixed media and a story. It was about breaking the race barrier in Alaska. So there's the two matriarchs. There's Kajasati and Kasanuk, and our grandmothers. You can see her there in the sitting down, and even while she was having her photograph made, she was still working. So that's partly why I really love this photograph, because that's the way our grandmother was. When people would come over to visit, she'd have her beadwork, and she'd serve them coffee or tea, and she'd keep on doing her beadwork while her visitor was there. And that's what as kids picked up on. It was kind of a natural thing. You see your grandmother, who never stops working, even when she has guests over, and that carried over to us, as part of the creative process. We just keep on working, and if people want to come over and visit, hey, that's fine. That's okay. Don't mind me. I'm going to keep on working while you talk. So I get that from, I should say we get that from our grandmother. In the spring of 1943, during World War II, our mother, Anita Brown, had the highest GPA, and the tradition was whomever that was would become either the May Queen or the May King. This was here in Juneau, in the early 1940s. Because racism stopped that, because she was Tlingit. And I was going through her snapshots, and I found this one. This one right here, and it stood out because it was color, first of all. Early 1940s, it was color. That meant somebody in the family had a really fancy camera, because the Kodachrome was really slow, slow ISO speed. So you had to be nearly a professional to get a good color photograph in the early 1940s. And there they were. Two service stars noted that the family had two family members serving in the military. Austin Brown, who was serving in Germany, and Roy Brown in the Aleutians. So when you walk around the neighborhood, you'd see service stars in the windows. And that denoted a family member who had who's serving overseas somewhere. National Geographic used the image to promote the All Roads Photographer Award winners. So that was nice too. And when they published this online, I showed it to my mom and she was pretty happy, to see it there. This is a photograph that has another visual narrative. So it's another example of my way of working by, writing first, making a visual narrative, and then making the photograph from it. So here's what the text says. Kincolith, the name of our village, translates to place on the beach where enemy skulls are planted. It helped us live in peace, and an added bonus was that we didn't have too many Jehovah's Witness types ringing our doorbells. It was a dark time in our history. Anyone got any spare skulls hanging around? Gingolix, this is in Canada. My father's Nishka from Canada. Gingolix has been occupied since ancient times. It is a highly desirable location near the mouth of the Nass River. Many neighboring tribes would invade in ancient times, and the matriarchs devised a plan to deter the wasteful invasions. They captured the chiefs of the local invading groups, cut their heads off, and planted their skulls on the beach. It acted as a deterrent, and the invasions ceased. They stopped. The story came from one of my Nishka aunties, and I had to get permission from my father to make this print. I showed him a proof print and asked him if he liked it. He put on his reading glasses, and he walked over to the table, and he was examining it. He was looking at it very closely, and he'd look up at me, and he'd look at it, and then I said, "What do you think?" Then he broke out laughing. He was just laughing. He said, "Can you make me a bigger one?" So there was my permission right there. So we're able to, I was able to tell the story, and again, that's what it's always been about as far as I was concerned. Having these visual narratives, writing it down in a journal, and then flipping through the journal a couple months later and thinking, oh yeah, look at that. I can visualize this thing. I can visualize this narrative, and I'm going to make a print out of it. And with this one in particular, because it slightly could be viewed as being controversial, I decided to make the photograph first and then show it to my dad. I wanted to actually see if he can feel, the story, get a sense of it. The name contains a story of the enemy's skulls planted on the beach. And it became slightly controversial even within my father's family, but you know what? He is the eldest, and he is also a chief. So his word was good for me. This is titled Dad from 2003. And this goes back to that photograph I showed you about 906 West 7th Street, because he lived there too. He migrated to Alaska back in the 1940s. There's the journal entry again. It started with a journal entry. To be born as a Nishka in the early 1920s mostly meant being taken from your family and placed in Indian boarding schools. Calling them schools is a bad joke. They are mostly corrupt Christian labor camps. If you survived, you received a third-grade education. In spite of this, our dad was driven to be a captain of many fishing boats over the decades. His generation of Native people had to overcome incredible odds just to survive, let alone prosper. They held on to our traditional identity and was almost wiped out. So I'm not very judgmental about the faults that were placed upon them when I consider everything that they had to endure. He was one of my mentors as a young man, so I always thank him every morning. Niska Simojit means most relied upon man, and it's a chief's name. So this is a very intimate photograph of when he was going through his ceremony, and the other chiefs were welcoming him into the circle of chiefs at the Nass River. Our dad left his Niska homeland as a young man to escape a traditional arranged marriage. This guy is the one who married her, and in order to restore his honor, he gave our dad extravagant gifts, in spite of really wanting to punch his lights out. After meeting her, I understand that there is such a thing as run away. There is as fast as you can. And still have honor. So it's a story of, our dad migrating here, to Alaska, because his Nisga'a, which is a Canadian tribe. So I'm half Nisga'a and half Tlingit. This one's titled Grandma, We Who Are Your Children. And it's monotype, mixed media and photography. The killer whale fin is done in the style of the northern Tlingit. And you can tell because up there in Klukwan, especially the Gushi hit, there's a circle on the top of the fin. So if you ever see, some of these killer whale designs, you can often tell that they're from the northern Chilkat because there's a circle at the top, like this one. And this was a monotype in mixed media. This was her grandmother on the left when she was a teenager. And the two people who are sitting next to her are the Cascos, who are related in the clan manner. They're also killer whales. This is titled Man of the Bear Clan, Herbert Johnson. The Kootznoowoo tribe commissioned me to photograph a number of their elders. This was back in the early 1980s. And it was also a collaboration with making oversized palladium prints with David Michael Kennedy. And I really love doing this series, So back in the late 70s and early 80s, I got a number of public art commissions, including many from tribes, to photograph elders. And it's a nice thing, too, because a lot of these elders have passed on now. And so for posterity, we have, some of their photographs, including who this building was named after. Walter Sobloff, and this was commissioned by Sealaska Corporation. So they hired me to make some portraits, including Walter. And I knew Walter, our family knew Walter pretty well. When I was born, he baptized me, in the old church over there on 8th Street. So that's where I was baptized. That's where our parents were married in a ceremony there. So a lot of the people from the community, were really close to Walter Soboleff because he was the heart and soul of the community, And when I went over to photograph him, was at the Sealaska building, and it was December, and it was cold out, and there was a blizzard outside, and I had the studio all set up in one of the boardrooms upstairs. And so when Walter came in, all he had to do was sit down, and I'd direct him, and I fired off probably 50 shots, and within a span of about 7 minutes, I had 50 different versions of him. So when he came in, he was, kind of stoic. He didn't remember me, obviously. So I broke the ice. I said, Walter, you baptized me. And it broke the ice. It literally broke the ice. And so I wanted some photographs of him smiling. And it was kind of challenging, but I had my ways. And so I said, Walter, where are all your other board members? I bet they're home asleep, right? And that made him laugh. I said, you're probably the only one here working, right? And he laughed again. So I fired off a bunch of shots. And that's why he's laughing here. It's because it's visualizing his fellow board members home asleep while he's out working hard. Dolores Churchill, this one was also commissioned by Sealaska. Went down to Ketchikan to make this photograph of her. I also did some bodies of work that had to do with the Yupiks in Western Alaska. This is Mrs. Cannerlack, and she was one of the master basket weavers from that area. And I asked her, I made some photographs of her when she was weaving at home. And I was talking to her, I said, and I call her Mrs. Cannerlack. And I said, Mrs. Cannerlack, I'd like to make some photographs of you picking the grass. And she kind of laughed and she said, well, you'll have to come back when it's really cold. And she said the saltwater grass turns probably 3 days before the snow falls. So it's this really narrow window. And I said, yeah, I could do that. And I gave her my phone number. I said, back in the days of landlines, I said, just call me Collect. Just let me know when the snow is coming, and I'll jump on the plane and I'll come out and make the photographs. So there I was at home working in my studio. I was making prints, and I get the phone call. He said, this is Mrs. Cannerlack. It's going to snow. I said, okay, I'll be out there tomorrow. And I packed up all my cameras and jumped on the plane and went out there. And sure enough, it was so cold there. It was bitter cold. The wind felt like it cut right through you. I had on my winter clothes and had my camera bags and everything, walking around with my Leicas and Nikons, and my fingers were freezing. But, so there I was, just following them around, making photographs. Anyway, it's a whole body of work. And this is Mrs. Thurchick. She's another one of the master basket weavers up there. And when I went into Mrs. Thurchick's house, it was her couch was against the window, which meant that she was a silhouette. As a photographer, I noticed that right off. I didn't want a silhouette photograph of her. So I asked her if I could move her couch, and she kind of, we had a little discussion about that, and finally she said, "Sure, go ahead." And so it was just me, so I was moving her couch around and so forth. So I put her couch right where the light was hitting the wall, and it lit the front of her face just beautifully. And she started weaving again, and I said, "Can you angle that?" So she went like this, and it was awkward for her, but it was perfect for the light. So anyway, she kind of laughed about it. So I made, half a dozen photographs really fast. That's the way I work, photograph really fast. And after that, I just moved the couch back. So it looked perfect again. So she was happy, I was happy. I got this photograph, and the world spun on. The Smithsonian, I showed the body of work to the Smithsonian, and they acquired some of them, which was nice too. So it's in their collection. If you ever go to Washington, D.C., you can see some of my work in their collection. And this shifts over to another body of work. It's titled The Feather Series, and it's about the arrival of Columbus to the Americas. And I was asked to do a series about that, and I wasn't sure what to do, so I decided to do one titled The Feather Series. And this one was titled 1491. And for me, it signified, the future that never was. I always ask myself, how would the Americas be if the Europeans never came here? What would have happened? And this was one of the ones that I had for my imagination, was we have the sky is the limit. America would be way different than it is now. 1492, Feather Series, platinum print. And it reminds me of what happened in 1492, when Columbus arrived, and it just represented death and destruction. National Geographic saw the series and they loved it, so they asked if they could put it on their website. And their website is titled Proof. So it's really nice because they showcase, portfolios of various photographers. And since I was in Washington, D.C., one of their editors showed up for one of my talks and she saw it and she asked if she could put it on their website. So to me, that represented the value of traveling. When you're traveling, meet people, talk to them, introduce yourself. And I have my cards. I gave her a card. It has my website and my email address on it. Easy to contact. That's the bottom line. When you're out, interacting as an artist, you should be interacting, circulating, introducing yourself. This is a different series. As a professional artist, it's good to apply to various calls for art, including ones like this one, which is titled Migrations, New Directions in Native American Art Project. It was juried by nationally known curators, and the project was well funded so that each artist could make 2 lithographs in collaboration with a master lithographer. Each artist was required to submit a short proposal describing the art they were pre-visualizing in a current resume. It is critical to keep an updated resume that is professionally written so that the evaluators are able to just glance at it and get an idea of where you are situated as a professional artist. This was a great project that resulted in showing art at national museums, a catalog, and an edition of lithographs. So it emphasizes professional practices, and that professional practices are an acquired skill. It's not anything you can just pick up overnight. It's good to get feedback. So when you're writing your resume, show it to some people that you respect. Show it to some administrators. Show it to fellow artists. And get feedback about it. And because with a resume, when they're evaluating submissions from 50 artists, you need to stand out from the crowd with all your materials, including your resume. Your resume just has to be crystal clear, perfect, which mine is. I can humbly say that because I've gotten professional feedback from mine. It wasn't just me. I had professors looking at it, and I get feedback from the professors. And the professors would say, yeah, you know what? Get rid of that. Get rid of this. This isn't written correctly. And there it was. My resume was covered in red ink. That's what a resume should be. You should get feedback and get that level of feedback from somebody who's really good at it. I do that for my own students, so I taught at the graduate level. So one of the things I required for my graduate students was to write a professional resume. I did the same thing. They'd submit a resume to me. I'd mark that thing all up. It would be covered with red ink again. And say, try again. Show me another one in 2 weeks. And they'd bring it back a second time, and it would have half the amount of red ink on it. Say, okay, try again. Go back and do it again. Until 8 weeks later, they finally had a good one. So that's what it takes, to have a professional artist portfolio resume. So this is one of the prints that came out of it. It's titled Edward Curtis's Last Photograph. It was a lithograph collaboration. And mine was, in the light of real Indians, poking fun at whatever the situation was, using satire. And the text at the bottom of the print said, Edward Curtis dressed a pair of Tlingit warriors in some costumes from the trunk of his car. It was the last photo he ever made. This one's titled Native Epistemology. It's a diptych from the one project. Again, lithographs. This one had a title on the bottom too. It says, Tonto. The Lone Ranger was taken aback by Tonto's resolve and wondered what epistemology meant. So this is a collaboration with the master printer Frank Jansen at the Crow Shadow Art Institute. It took us about 2 weeks to do the project, 8 to 5 days a week, very labor intensive. And I got a new respect for printmaking at that time because I didn't know what lithography was, and I got admitted to this project because of the strength of my art. And it was okay with them that I didn't know lithography because they said, you're going to have a master lithographer there. This is titled, this is Edward Curtis's flagship photograph. And it's about the vanishing race, about how Indians people no longer exist. I set the record straight, we're still here. And instead of a vanishing race with Indians disappearing off into the sunset, I have them attending a winter healing ceremony. So instead of riding off into the sunset, they're riding off to a winter solstice ceremony. Old res truck off to the side. And if you look at a 45-degree angle to the print, I use invisible ink to name the names of the native nations. So when you look straight on to the lithograph, you can't see the names. They're invisible. But if you stand at an angle, they all appear as if by magic. It's also part of the Arts and Embassies program in Washington, D.C. You can look it up. This one's titled Mass, Mass, and More Mass, about the early 20th century. Now, Curtis used to use fake Indians for his work. This was titled in the text, Visual Currencies. In the true spirit of white man, I stole this car in my search for America. And there's a title. You can go to the website and read it. It's kind of tongue-in-cheek and it has satire and humor in it. It's about stealing a car to go see America, which is kind of a metaphor for Europeans arriving in America and stealing America. This is titled Fly Don't Walk. After watching a bird and shadow dance on a very white wall, I was going to cross the street but came to a Don't Walk sign. Finally, the red hand turned in the figure of a white man walking. Not wanting to offend anyone, I did my best impression of a white man walking and crossed the street. This was for a commission for a billboard in Santa Fe. I had fun with this one. The land. This was shot out the road here on a rainy day. I love photographing in the rain too. This is from a series called the Sacred Series. Humor, it has humor in it. I have so many prints, I'm just giving you kind of a fast preview. And you can go to my website, it's just larrymcneil.com, and you could, take the time to read, these photographs. And this is Bonehead Humans lithograph from 2008. It's a collaboration with the Crow Shadow Art Institute. And this was the start of when I started doing the climate crisis work in 2008. White Raven. Raven was white before he stole the sun. Time to steal the earth from those bonehead humans. Tonto's Earthen House. I was conversing with Terry Rovkar about how to cover a gas mask with spruce roots when she became ill. So I had to figure this out for myself. I wanted a gas mask that was covered in spruce roots. And I did it. I figured it out. I also wanted a Tlingit Cadillac. Demented Coal Paradox, platinum print with a spruce root mask again. White Raven Ceremonial. It's a coal power plant in the Midwest. Monumental. This thing was huge. And I wanted a spruce root gas mask because when we were photographing these coal power plants, my nose got infected, from the emissions. And I was thinking, how do these people live in this area anyway? And then we realized, oh, it's poor people. You know, the poor live by these coal power plants, and they're the ones who are always sick and have infections and so forth. So that's what this was about, too. Raven dreamt about light, Tlingit electric car, spruce root gas mask, and a chilkat robe. It's hot here at the Antelope coal mine, the largest in North America. So this was about an hour away from the Antelope coal mine, which is the biggest one in North America. Tlingit car, look at that. Climate chaos, abandoned steel mill, Mercedes converted to a Tlingit electric car. Climate chaos. Here's how I Tlingitized the car. I wanted the basket root on the edge of the car, you know, the spruce root design of the killer whale teeth. So this comes from our own clan, you know, the design of the killer whale teeth. And it's electric too. Look, it's plugged in. Spruce root gas mask again. This is titled Miss Coyote, Love, Gratitude, and Anvils. Climate chaos again. There's old oil drums rotting in the grass. And there's Miss Coyote. Really love this photograph because right outside our back door where we live in Idaho, nature is just right there. You know, you see coyote and deer and all kinds of wild animals. And there she was right there. So my wife, Debbie, who's sitting right here, allowed me to park my cameras on the table by our front door, our back door. So for 2 years, my cameras took up that part of the table. So thank you for that. And that's why I was able to get this photograph, because my camera was always at the ready. You know, there it was. So when we saw Miss Coyote, camera was all ready to go. Here's some studio production work. You know, had to photograph the gas mask against the green screen. Those are all the tools I use. You know, when I go into a studio, need the chroma key there too, you know, for making the larger photographs. So it's an entire production to make these photographs. Location work, you know, off in the backcountry. And this is with Steve Henriksen from the Alaska State Museum. Was doing some research there in their collections. And he was so gracious. He spent the afternoon with me. I was able to bring in my lights and make photographs. So I have gratitude to the Alaska State Museum. Gunashish, thank you for that. So if you have more time, you can go to here's what my website looks like. Easy to remember, LarryMcNeil.com. There it is. And it's a collaboration with a graphic designer. I love collaborating with people. So John Francis was the graphic designer who actually put it together with me. Okay, thank you. We have time for any questions or comments?
Any questions in the clan house?
Sheesh, Larry. I don't have any questions, but I did want to share some important information about Larry and some of the work that he did in the early 80s. He was the main photographer for Alaska Native magazine, and this is significant because in the early 80s, ANCSA and Native corporations were only 10 years old. This was at a time when our culture and our art was re-emerging from 100 years of oppression. And so to have his artwork on the cover of a monthly magazine gave non-Native people the opportunity to see our art, to see Native people in rural Alaska, but also importantly, to help the business community understand that Native corporations were contributing to the economy because it was had only been a decade. But Larry's work, and I'll hold up a couple of them because they're so neat, really brought visualization to Native people are here, but we're also part of the modern world. It wasn't something that people saw back then like we do now. Tundra Times, I think, was the only publication then, and so Alaska Native Magazine was significant in that it focused on, it was issue oriented, so a little bit more in-depth articles and about rural Alaska, about Native corporations. But we're really grateful that Larry sort of brought all of these important issues visually to the rest of Alaska. I want to show you one of my favorite ones. I have lots of favorite ones, but sorry. But, this one, and this is at a time, too, when there was no digital photography. You had to rewind your film and bring it to a shop to develop and wait a week, 10 days or something for them to develop it. But this one features Nelson Angapak, who was the CEO for Sealaska Corporation. And you can see him standing in a business suit. Again, in the 80s, that wasn't a common thing. But he's looking in the mirror at himself wearing a parka, a traditional parka. And so to stage this, I know it was a lot of work. And again, there was no Photoshop. But this was, an example, a good example of the work that Larry did, bringing his talent to the rest of Alaska and helping Alaska Native Magazine succeed in the early 80s. So, goodness cheesh. Goodness cheesh.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. That brings back so many warm memories. Sorry, go ahead.
Any other questions?
Hello. Thank you. Hello, I'm Vernon. I met you earlier. When you walk by windows or pictures and you see the reflection in the light and you see the trees or other people, is that what what you see in your pictures? Is that what you bring forth?
Yeah, you know what? That's such a great question. I love that. Another way of phrasing that is just noticing things. And I think that's what makes people creative. Writers, sculptors, painters, humans, everybody. As we're just walking down the street, and we ask ourselves, what do we notice? What do we see every day? And I think that's one of the things that sets everybody apart. That part of our creativity is what we see in just our mundane, everyday life. And sometimes it can be very significant, just that mundane thing that maybe other people just walked by and didn't even see it, or maybe I walked right by something and somebody else saw it, which happens a lot too. It's like so I'll pause and I'll go, oh yeah, they saw that cool little thing there. So that's significant, regardless of your media. So yeah, great, because it asks about the creative process. Yeah. Yeah.
They say a story tells 1,000 stories. Would you consider yourself a visual storyteller?
Yes, definitely a visual storyteller, but it started off with writing. And actually, I ask myself that same question sometimes. And it started in the third grade. Because in the third grade, right up here at the school, up the hill here, show and tell. We all remember show and tell, right, from elementary school. And I would never have anything to show. I'd forget about it, and I'd be saying, and the teacher would call on me, and so you'd have to go walk in front of your classmates and show them this cool thing. And because I always forget stuff, I always had stories. so, so I'd be entertaining my classmates with these goofy stories, and that just carried on years later. That I think that's the origins of it right there, though. Is telling stories about the things that you experience, and I think that's really at the heart and soul of the creative process. Each one of you has your own stories, that are significant to you, and you make work about it, because that's what that's what you're comfortable with. Whether it's, writing, or painting, or maybe you're a sculptor, maybe you're a beadworker, and you saw these beautiful flowers on your hike the other day, and you're thinking, I'm going to bead that, I'm going to, maybe make a sketch of it and make beadwork, and that becomes a part of your visual story. So anyway, I think that's how it all kind of morphs together. Just everyday mundane things, becomes a story, and then it becomes a part of a visual narrative. Yeah, for everybody, not just me. Yeah. Great question. I like that. Anybody else? Yeah.
I just have a comment that I really like that what you just said, because some of those mundane things, when they're brought forward to our attention, have great significance in just the meaning of. Anyway, thanks.
That's right. And that's how a lot of my photographs, my prints happened. For example, the one titled Once Upon a Time in America, about my mother when she was a teenager, sitting with her mother. She let me go through her snapshots one day, so I was looking at them, and it caught my attention, and I pulled it over to the table, and I asked her about it, and she told me the whole story of this thing. And that story wouldn't have happened, if she didn't have that snapshot. All it was a family snapshot, but a very significant one. And so it had that really significant story to it, that had to do with breaking the race barrier in Alaska, because these were the territorial times, pre-statehood. And of course, back then, racism was rampant, and Native students were not allowed in the public schools yet. So the Alaska Native Brotherhood came up with a strategy to help break the ice. And their plan was to get a half a dozen young students together and just enroll them in the public schools, just like that. And my mom wasn't the only one. Like I said, there were about 6 of them. And so that's how the race barrier was broken. And I was thinking, that came from a snapshot, in a drawer, this story that she kept. And I thought that was such a profound moment in history that I asked her if I could make a photograph, make a print about it. And I always ask permission for things like that. And she said, yeah, go ahead, give it a spin. Yeah.
I've talked to people here that remember there were signs in the businesses around town that said no Indians allowed. Do you remember seeing those?
That was before my time. They'd been around, but I didn't notice them. But our parents' generation sure did. And of course, the photographs are still there too. You can go into the state archives here in Juneau, and you can, spend an afternoon doing research, and they'll show up. And they're even in the winter and pond photographs. So if you look at some of those winter and pond photographs, there's some photographs of the early 1900s of downtown Juneau, and you'll see signs like that. It says things like "No natives allowed," things like that. So it was still there, in that era. And I was just talking to my wife on the way over here. We were noticing the Winter and Pond building on the corner, you know, where the Triangle Bar is. And my mom was telling me the story, and she said when she was in high school, she had to get her high school portrait done, and she said she went into the Winter and Pond studio. So this was in the early 1940s, and they were still there. You know, they're still making photographs. And she said she remembers walking into their studio, and she said it smelled bad. And she kind of went like this. And I never knew if it was because, I think it was because of the darkroom. You know, they had a darkroom. Of course, if you're a photographer, you know, there's lots of chemicals there. And the chemicals have a distinct aroma, you know, and that's probably what she smelled in there, you know. Winter and Pond. So we have our own family Winter and Pond story. Yeah, thank you. I am, yes. So where I left off was Miss Coyote, you know, about the global climate crisis. So I've been working on the global climate crisis since 2008. And in 2008, I became a bicycle commuter. I gave up my car. So there I was, riding my bike to school in the snow, you know, because I felt so strongly about not driving an automobile. And at that time, I was thinking, well, when I save up enough money, I'm going to get an electric car. And so sure enough, that's what I drive. That's why I kind of feel at home now, because, you know, walking around Juneau, I have a Subaru Solterra, which is an electric car, and I see them all over town. I'm thinking, wow, I could fit right in here. This is like my kind of place. So I really love traveling and going on the road, you know, and making photographs. You know, just like the one I showed you of the coyote, you know, and photographing nature, photographing the landscape, you know, and what's happening with climate change, you know. So it's interesting because that first lithograph that I made in 2008 of the raven, white raven, nobody liked that, you know, because it was deemed too controversial. You know, so if you ever go to Crow's Shadow, they got a whole stack of them. You can get them cheap. And I'm thinking, this is interesting, because this is some of the earliest work, you know, where artists were doing work about the global climate crisis. And in 2008, nobody cared. You know, people were in full denial about it, you know, and now they care. I should say now we care. You know, now it's at the forefront, and, you know, we can feel the full effects of what's going on with it. And so new work is just trying to navigate that. And I'm not sure what'll happen. You know, I love the idea of, you know, the creative process and taking journeys and just seeing what happens. So that's what's going on right now. And of course, I have my journals that I write in, and so I have a journal that has a dozen photographs that need to be made right now. So all I need is the time to do it now.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for our lecture series. Have a good day.
Thank you for coming.